Well, welcome back. This, once again, is a digital cut-in. It is Election Day 2024. Jai Cunningham here. We appreciate you stopping by for the very latest on not just our local elections with the polls set to close at 7 o'clock tonight, but as we've seen through a number of our cut-ins from the national news, we have seen that a number of the voting centers still have long lines. And so we're expecting anyone who is in line at 7 o'clock will be allowed to vote. So many of those voting centers are expected to stay open well past 7 o'clock because there are people in line. We've seen out at Kapolei Hale and we've seen at Honolulu Hale where there are literally hundreds of people who are still there. We also want to talk, though, about the presidential election because we've seen a lot of numbers start to roll in. I want to welcome in Dr. Jennifer Walsh. She is Senior Vice President with Hawaii Pacific University, also the Provost. And I tell you what we've been seeing so far, you're the expert on this one, and we've seen the states start to fall the way they are falling. Your thoughts, your initial thoughts, because I've heard underperforming and overperforming.
Right.
Explain to me.
Yeah, exactly. The last hour has really changed the landscape quite a bit. So coming into tonight, we had almost a statistical dead heat between Harris and Trump. So we knew that tonight was going to be critical on an hour-by-hour basis, and certainly we're seeing that show up to be true. So in Pennsylvania, for example, this is still too close to call. We don't yet have all of the votes counted, and we probably won't officially until later this week even, because they had so many early election votes come in by mail. However, what we are seeing is Trump really overperforming in the rural areas compared to how he did back in 2020. So we would expect that if Harris had a chance of capturing Pennsylvania, that she would have enough votes, or she would be overperforming in her own areas, predominantly Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, to overcome the strength that he's showing. And we're just not seeing that come true yet. So say Harris's campaign is probably a little nervous right now.
I was going to say, and when we look at Philadelphia, that's a prime example. You talked about rural versus urban. And when you look at the state, it's very noticeable that you have 4 or 5 sort of outposts of blue, right, but the huge majority, at least land-wise, right, is red.
Right. So most states, with Nebraska and Maine being the noticeable exceptions here, it's a winner-take-all system. So it really doesn't matter county by county how the candidates are doing. In the end of the day, it comes down to who has the most votes in a particular state. However, Harris and Trump both are counting on their voters to show up in stronger numbers to dilute the response of the other side, especially in a state like Pennsylvania, where you have almost even numbers to start with between registered Democrats and registered Republicans.
It's something that's been in place for hundreds of years. The Electoral College versus popular vote, because we had spoke earlier during our last digital hit. It's possible that Kamala Harris could get more votes than Donald Trump, yet lose this election.
That's right. And that's been the trend we've seen in recent elections. So this certainly wouldn't be new if that were the case. And that has to do with how those votes are calculated across the country. So in our winner-take-all system, each state represents a single unit. So it doesn't matter if they win by 80% of the vote or 51% of the vote. The winner gets all of the Electoral College votes. So when you see results from the middle of the country, Nebraska, Kansas, recently we just saw that Trump won Ohio. Those votes actually might have been pretty close in terms of numbers, but because of that winner take all, the entire state is colored either red or blue. And candidates now do the math. They try to figure out, okay, if I have Texas and I give up California, what's the path to the White House? And this is really a design going back to our constitutional structure, where it's meant to preserve our very fractured union in some semblance of a country. Otherwise, you would have perhaps one country representing the coastal areas and another country representing the center of the country, and that would have been, very difficult to manage and hang together as a unified union.
With where we stand now, do you think that's fair? I mean, a lot of people say, okay, if you do live in Los Angeles, if you do live in New York City, you should be more important than people who live in Waterloo, Iowa.
Right. No, that's a very valid criticism. And what we're starting to see is that people in those larger states, they feel disenfranchised. They feel like the candidates aren't paying any attention to their issues, even though they represent a very large percent of the population. If you're a voter in California, for example, you probably aren't getting much attention unless they're coming to raise money in your backyard. But in terms of your core needs, they're probably not as worried about you because it's either discounted already or already taken for granted. So the one solution that we can talk more about later is whether doing it by congressional district, which we have the authority to do without a constitutional amendment, is one way to address those voter concerns. So everybody feels like they're getting some attention by the candidates.
I was going to say, when you talk New York City, the largest city in America, you talk about Los Angeles, the second largest, you're talking about Chicago, you're talking about the top 5, 8, 10 cities in the country that don't get much attention.
Right.
And they probably should.
Right. So even here in Hawaii, we might have, one congressional district where you have a variety of voters leaning in one direction, and perhaps the neighboring islands would find themselves in a different, political situation at some point in the future. And having a district by district approach at least requires candidates to pay attention to all of the voters' needs, not just the ones in these few swing states.
What do you think, and we've talked a little bit earlier about this, you made mention of it, what are the 2 or 3 most important topics, do you believe, that are sort of driving people at this election?
Well, we've been focusing a lot on character and personality, and certainly when we were talking about Biden's age and Trump's even advanced age and their relative health and whether or not they could make it another 4 years, we weren't really talking about the economy, but that right now is showing up as one of the most important concerns for voters. They vote with their pocketbook, and it's not unlike what Ronald Reagan said when he first ran for office. He asked the American people, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? And that question continues to resonate with voters. Many are saying today that they are not better off, at least economically, than they were in prior administrations.
He may have said that 30, 40 years ago, and it's still holding true, and it's still a mantra that you're hearing this past election, really, right?
Inflation, housing costs, energy costs, food costs have all hit Americans and where it hurts, their pocketbook. And it makes projecting into the future much more difficult when they can't see a pathway to economic prosperity. The one thing that Trump has been very successful at is by basically saying, I hear you and I have a plan. He hasn't shared necessarily the details of that plan, but the voters are trusting that a different administration might bring about different results.
I was going to say, it's funny how the pocketbook or the wallet kind of can dictate how you vote.
Very much so, still today.
Yeah. Dr. Walsh, we appreciate you being with us for these digital hits throughout the afternoon to sort of break down what's happening nationally, and we appreciate your insight that you've been able to share with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you so much, and we appreciate HPU for loaning us out to us for the evening. Yeah. So here's what we have planned. 6 o'clock and 6:30 we'll have newscast. We have heard from down at Honolulu Hale and the state capitol, I should say, that we're not going to get that first printout till 11 o'clock tonight is what's likely. So we will have a 6 o'clock newscast, 6:30 newscast as well right here on Island News. We appreciate you joining us for these digital hits as well. Stay tuned, and we will, of course, keep you updated not just on the local races, but the national races as well. Thank you for joining us.